Hello, and welcome to RRI Explained, a ResBIOS podcast. It is the aim of the ResBIOS project to embed responsible research and innovation, or RRI, into 4 universities across Europe, in the hope of improving the interconnectivity between science research and society, with a particular focus on the biosciences. But what is RRI exactly? Well, hopefully we can find out together. Today we are joined by Dr. Phil René von Schomberg, a philosopher and STS scholar at the Kate Hamburg Kolleg International Center for Advanced Studies, and also a guest professor at the Technical University of Darmstadt. Today, Rene will be discussing the history of RRI and how RRI principles have evolved since its inception. Thank you for joining us today, Rene. You've had a very varied career and been on the road through RRI for a long time, throughout its history. I was just wondering, could you describe a little bit your journey to where you are now and what led you to working with RRI in such a dramatic way?
I think, although I didn't use the term in this way, I actually was occupied with the topics already when I was a student at the Agriculture University in Wageningen in the Netherlands in 1980, especially when we had, I think it was in the spring of 1980, we had a massive occupation of the main administrative building of the university to protest against a university which implemented a form of education which was too much disassociated from the big, what we now call the big societal problems, the societal challenges nowadays. So at the University of Wageningen, this was, of course, food security and quality of food, environmental problems, etc. So I think there were actually 2 major issues which are still up to today. You can see a very clear line, although the positions of the actors has changed in course, whereas in the 1980s it was an activity mainly of students to connect science and society. There was an upcoming, let's say, movement, can call it the science society movement, with little units emerging at various universities, and which later grow into more professional work also on this topic. But the main questions and the points of departure are actually not much different as today. So it's still about how we can address our big societal problems beyond technological means, because this was, of course, the historical, let's say, constant. It was always a belief that with technological innovation, we can master all these problems. Whereas, of course, I think there has been a progressive insight over the last 40 years that technological innovation is, of course, important, but you can not solve these big issues when you don't address the social dimension and the social component of it as well.
It's interesting that you say that it was quite student-led to begin with. Was that the temperature of the room at that moment with the student body, that they felt some fundamental way that research and academia is conducted just needed to be changed?
Well, I think it was a very broadly shared feeling of students. I would say it was a very broadly carried idea that the educational system at that time was too much disassociated from the social problems we face. If you now look to the same university, the University of Wageningen, if you go there, then actually that university now advertises itself by saying, okay, we are addressing the big societal issues and we address them with technological and social means at the same time. So in a sort of way, almost carry RRI in the main flag, carrying it as a university. So you see there has been certainly a shift, whereas, let's say, in my time, it was more or less an uphill struggle. For example, I did in my studies a large part on science and society issues, which was very rare at those days to do that within a natural science study. But these things have changed quite a bit over time, especially in the academic thinking around it, but we still face the same institutional problems.
So as you obviously know, RRI consists of the 5 keys of RRI. How important do you think it was to combine these 5 issues under the umbrella of RRI, and how has that benefited kind of research practice overall?
Well, there I have to be a little bit critical. In fact, for me, RRI is not about these 5 keys at all. For me, these 5 keys were a sort of regress in thinking of about RRI. The main issue for me for responsible research and innovation was to have, similar as in the 1980s, we would have an idea about research and innovation, how we can drive research and innovation towards social desirable ends. This is, let's say, this is a small word, but it has big problems in the sense that, normally innovations, they come over us. We are object of change rather than we are subject of change. That the utopia, so to speak, from RRI is that we can design our innovations in the way we want, or even have technologies and their characteristics determined with futures which we want them to have. Now, I think the 5 keys were elements which actually preceded RRI in the science of society programs, when it comes to ethics or to societal engagement and so on. Of course, all these elements are important also in RRI, but the main focus is actually an institutional question, which, as I mentioned, remains high on the agenda. This didn't change since the 1980s. In certain ways, it's even more problematic nowadays than then, because we have huge market deficits in getting the innovations which we want. Became very apparent now also with COVID. If you want to have a vaccine, we have to reorganize science and also the market mechanisms in order to get it. If we wouldn't have opened up science and if we wouldn't have subsidized the multinationals, we would not have so quickly a vaccine. But this is the same for the big societal problems when it comes to climate change or food security. All these issues, they are all equally urgent as COVID. And a business as usual means that the transitions towards the type of innovations which are socially desirable are actually blocked by these market deficits and the way we organize and finance research and innovation. This is still the main problem. And I think that issue is much more, so all these keys where you refer to, they are, of course, relevant for RRI, but they are only, let's say, appropriate when these keys themselves are transformed. So if you talk about ethics, for example, it's not about the ethics of new technologies, but it's about organizing co-responsibility over the innovation process. So that means also that we have to go beyond, within science, we have to go beyond issues of scientific integrity. I mean, normally scientists have refrained of taking responsibility on outcomes of science and technology beyond scientific integrity. But this is exactly what we need to do. And this is, of course, not an issue for scientists alone. This is an issue for all actors involved in the innovation process, from research funders to industrial actors and to citizens. It's what I call organizing co-responsibility over this issue. And this is something else than just doing ethics of new technologies, for example. So all these keys are relevant, but they are only relevant for me in RRI if they themselves also transform. For example, public engagement with science was indeed something which started off what I was referring to in the 1980s, and actually already before that, in terms of involving citizens in science. But RRI is more than just, let's say, putting stakeholders together. It's about creating a social commitment on what we want to get out of science and technology in terms of social desirable outcomes. And I think only very recently you can see now institutional innovations, I would say, such as the Green Deal, what the Commission and the EU now is doing, even backing up it with legislative proposals to try to foster research and innovation to the type of outcomes we want to see. So it's also indeed about becoming, as a public authority, and so not just the European Commission, but all kinds of public authorities becoming more proactive in the innovation process and not leaving everything over to the market. And I think in terms of relative progress on the issue, as I said, since the 1980s, there has been a growing insight and a change in the academic realm on tackling these issues. But institutionally in our society, we have seen an opposite direction where we have progressively left more things over to the market. So the last 20 years has been very much dominated by a neoliberal thought that with market innovation we can solve these problems which are facing us. And this is, of course, not true.
No, that's really interesting. And it leads quite well onto my next question. As you mentioned that, yes, the 5 keys of RRI are a good foundation, perhaps, but as research has evolved, how our perceptions of RRI have changed and how societal needs have changed, we would hope that these keys would evolve and the whole outlook on RRI would also evolve with how research and societal needs change. Quite a lot of industry leads and societal actors and obviously EU projects have now kind of taken up the mantle of RRI. I'm just wondering how the perception of RRI has changed since its inception. You say it was a bit of an uphill struggle to begin with, but it seems to be fairly widely established within the zeitgeist of academia and industry. Would you say that was true?
Yes, I certainly say that in terms of our thinking about it, I think there has been great progress. And what is also a success in terms of RRI is that, I mean, we have created the last 10 years a very large community across disciplines, across backgrounds, to take up research and innovation in those terms. And I think this is, even if you would disagree with, elements of it, in individual insights, this as a community is to create such a community, such an engaged community is in itself a great success. And certainly that has contributed to further changes, especially in how we fund and organize science. And I think this is what you can now see also at the new European Program for Research and Innovation, which is very clearly oriented around societal challenges and with the missions in terms of co-design and co-creation has taken up elements of RRI thinking, which is quite significant. And I think this has also received follow-up and in many other member states and institutions trying to address this in the same way. RRI has traveled to China, for example. I had in 2013 already a workshop with the Chinese Association for Science and Technology on RRI, and eventually they have made reference to RRI in their 5-year science and technology innovation program. So also internationally, it echoed quite well. So you can say that in thinking and also in policy thinking, there has been significant progress.
Recently, you co-authored a quite extensive review on RRI, like the unfinished journey of RRI. I suppose this sort of rolls in a couple of my thoughts, really. I'm just wondering, I don't know, what are the main benefits that you've seen of this intake of RRI? And what would you have changed at the inception, do you think? Would there been some fundamental framework that you might have instilled? And then, what is the future of RRI? As you say, it's evolving, but will it evolve into something totally different? Or do you see it sticking around in a similar form to what it is now?
I think when we catch up where we were in our previous conversation about the 5 keys. So, again, so the social political challenge is actually how do you manage the research and innovation process? And is it possible to direct the research and innovation towards social desirable ends? And then the question, of course, is what are social desirable ends? How we decide upon them? I mean, these are the key questions. So when I left at that time the RRI unit, this was still the main challenge, but then it downgraded to these 5 keys, unfortunately. And one of the reasons we made this review was to get RRI in its original form back on the agenda, as I put it. At the same time, though, when I left the RRI unit and started working on open science with a very few colleagues, which then steadily grew over time because it became a priority of the MODAS commission. Then I was anticipating that although we could not articulate it at that moment in such a way, but that open science would further back up RRI. And this is what you can now actually see in the further evolution of RRI. So one of the elements in order to address the main question, how to drive research and innovation towards social desirable ends, is that this is only possible if we open up research and innovation. Means not just open access to resources like knowledge and data, but means opening up in terms of that scientists are incentivized to work together. We have, in my view, we have a science system which is too competitive. We lose a lot of time. I mean, researchers spend 30% of the time of trying to get research grants, which eventually they don't get. If you would use all the time they use for applying for research grants in terms of working together on a societal problem, we would have gained one. I mean, it's interesting, they made once a time a calculation for Australia, and for 1 year, I think it was 2012 year, they estimated that 500 years of work was wasted to apply for grants, which subsequently were not awarded to these researchers. So you can see that our scientific system is very competitive and at the same time not collaborative. And as always, we make progress in the world, unfortunately, when we see a crisis. So COVID was a crisis, and that helped us actually to accelerate also open science, because there you can see that if you don't do open science, you actually, it costs people's life. We already saw that with in my publications. I always use Ebola and later also Zika as examples where doing open science saves lives, gets earlier vaccines. But you know how the world is organized. Ebola is seen as a problem of Africa, not of the world. And COVID was something which hit all of us. So that's a little bit cynical, but we need but indeed, we needed a crisis like that in order to get us fully aware of the failure of how we organize and incentivize science. We really have to get away from rewarding scientists in terms of their outputs, in terms of publications. We have to reward them in their research behavior. Do they collaborate? Do they share data early? And that's very fundamental. Unless we don't make institutional changes there, we will not have the same outcomes like with COVID. We will not get, let's say, if a vaccine can count as a social desirable output, we don't get there. If we would, as I said before, if we would not have opened up science in COVID, we would have to wait 10 or 20 years for a vaccine, if at all, because economically, apparently, it's not even beneficial for the big pharmaceutical firms to produce a vaccine like that. We face this institutional problem, and I think I always called it, International Handbook on Responsible Research Innovation, that open science in this radical way is a necessary condition for RRI. It's not sufficient because then opening up does not mean that we can give directly a direction to research and innovation, but it's essential. And without it, we will not get there. So I think this is what changed more recently. So open science, let's say, backing up our RRI ambitions. I hope this is not just for COVID, but that this will also lead to changes in other fields.
No, that's really interesting to say because, there seems to be quite a lot of competition between acquiring grants, getting publications in journals, and how scientists are evaluated on their value seems just to be kind of a way of siloing people's research rather than opening it up. So these approaches with RRI linking to open science and citizen science, it kind of makes it shareware is kind of the term that comes to mind, but where information is more easily accessible and there's less priority to keep your research to yourself until you publicize it, I suppose. And that kind of leads quite well to my other question. A few weeks ago, you were very kindly part of our Stepping Up and Stepping Out ResBIOS and StepChange joint event on citizen science and RRI. I was just wondering, how do you feel that these other alternative approaches to research within the fields of like bioscience and sciences in general, how do they interconnect with each other? They, as you say, they probably learn a lot from each other. They're all evolving systems, but I'm just wondering what your opinion is on that.
Well, I mean, this is, you mentioned now, for example, let's say the phenomenon of citizen science. And I think that has also evolved over the last 20 years, let's say, from not just counting birds or, looking to the stars or whatever, to a form, let's say, where citizen science is not just citizens helping scientists, but citizens doing science. And this actually, again, raises institutional issues because citizens are normally not funded. If you, as a citizen, want to do research, you apply for funding, you don't get it. They say you don't work at a university, and then you would ask, why did I get it and I don't get it? And they say, yeah, but you are not a scientist, even if you have a PhD, let's say. So it refers a little bit to what you account as science and not, and there you see also the self-referential element of science, that science is only science if it has an institution, although nobody can, in that institution, can tell you what's the definition of science. They cannot also not tell you what's the definition of excellence or the definition of quality of science, because this is all decided in peer review on a case-for-case basis. So it raises a sort of legitimacy issue, I would almost say. And I think it's interesting that if you see how forcefully citizen science has developed over the years, you can see that the outcome of science and technology is then also different. Because, I mean, citizen science is also science, yet if citizens engage in science, they have a stake in the outcome. And that means other type of outcomes. Of course, if you are a climate scientist, for example, you work on climate models at a global scale. And of course, it is all from a scientific point of view, of course, all very essential. But what it means for the city of Brussels, let's say, we have no idea. But if citizens engage with the same topic, then they look to precisely these issues. What does it mean for me in my city? What does it mean for, and this is what scientists normally don't address, because either it's not interesting for them in terms of publication. Because if you want to make a publication on what does it mean in, let's say, in neighborhood of Brussels, then you get not published. If you have a global new model for climate change, yeah, then you get published. You see what I mean? But the importance is, of course, of the latter it's equally important. And I think this is where citizen science actually, I always say citizens go where normal scientists don't go. And they go to areas which are relevant for us. And it's not scientifically relevant in terms of getting it in a sexy journal, but it's relevant for our lives and we have to do it. And this is very often also the type of science which we don't fund, although it's extremely relevant. And again, an example of an institutional challenge that we have to change the way we fund and organize science. So I think we have seen it over years. I've seen this movement. So I think there, of course, citizen science is actually addresses an RRI element. It addresses the element to articulate how type of innovations we want in our living areas. And so this is, in other words, to drive the innovations towards social desirable outputs. So this is where citizen science contributes to. And I think you see this now echoed as well in the European Commission has now, in a certain way, to my surprise, because I didn't anticipate that it would get so massive policy support, but there is an enormous attention now of involving citizens in research and innovation. So I think it's a challenge. And I think what is really would be new is that citizens not, as I say before, not just participate in science as such, but co-define the research agendas. And this is now an opportunity under the new framework program. And I hope that this will lead to success stories. It's an opportunity, it's a progress in terms of policy, I would say. At the same time, it's also a challenge because it means that a lot of scientists or actors will need to work with citizens from their nature, probably not would have the inclination to do so. So that means that that's then also a challenge, because if people are let's say, forced to work together. I said we have to promote collaboration across actors, across disciplines, but if they are not used to that, and if they are not from their nature, let's say, not open to that, but forced to do it because this is what the program demands, then this can impact, of course, the quality. But I hope that the RRI community, which has, of course, experience in this area, would jump on that and say, okay, we are here to assist, because this is one. It's an opportunity and a challenge which we are facing us. I think this is also the message we had in this article where you refer to.
No, that's really interesting and kind of leads on to my next point, just because a lot of the EU projects which are focused on RRI, ResBIOS included, are about introducing these principles and practices into groups of universities, either around Europe or wider afield. But your work with the EU Commission probably gets more at the base level of policy change and changes to modern research practices. Would you say that was true?
Yes, I think you can most clearly see it now at the instrument which we call them mission-oriented research. I mean, there you see, the whole language of the program, which is on co-design and co-creation, is of course an RRI language, I would say. The involvement of stakeholders and citizens co-define research and innovation. And then, of course, also the element of mission-oriented research in terms of that we want to address particular societal challenges with a priority, and that we democratize the decision-making about which missions we should have, and that we have a broad involvement about a discussion how we define the missions. So these elements are clearly RRI language. It's not referred to explicitly anymore, but the components are actually there. And RRI is, of course, a strategic objective of the program as such. It's in the legal requirement, so it's pretty much anchored, I would say now. So the theory at the moment is not bad. I would say of positive, but pretty good. It's now a matter of whether these things will be implemented well, and indeed will lead to what I said before, institutional changes. So also indeed within universities and do and fund the research.
This is a bit of a curveball question to finish off with, but as you've done a review of sort of the past decade of RRI, and obviously since that decade began, there's been a magnitude of changes, as you say, the onset of COVID and everything has sort of caused a shift, but also public engagement, how the media talks about science, how connected we are through smart technology and broadband. I don't know, do you have a prediction for the next 10 years, perhaps?
Yeah, well, the predictions are always difficult to make, but I think one of the biggest issue is how we see knowledge generation in science as a common good, yes or no. If I use the example of COVID again and drive it a little bit further, then we can say, okay, the knowledge we produce on these viruses should actually be a common good. And it should be also the vaccine which we produce and which we employ should actually be a common good, because we are actually only safe if everybody has access to those vaccines. So this is why I actually also called for vaccines as a planetary public good, not just as a national public good, which is actually in a certain way established in Europe, because European health policy at the national level have ensured, of course, access to those vaccines for their citizens. But we haven't done so yet on the planetary level. And it's equally important. And it's, of course, an illusion to think that if you have only access to these vaccines in Europe and not elsewhere, that we then are safe, and we are not. So this idea of articulating what are common goods, the same like access to clean water or clean air, this type of issues. Are we willing to address this issue more radically even than we did in the COVID case? And I think this is a big challenge. You can see also if these terms like RRI and open science further evolve and are adopted by, let's say, institutions which were previously our opponents, so to speak, or people who were actually resistant to this change, you can also note that they accommodate these words like open science, but they actually don't do open science. So you see now an evolvement of open science in terms of what you can call gold open access to publications, for example. And that means, for example, again, a sort of exclusion of knowledge actors. If, for example, if you don't work at a university and you want to write a scientific article, you don't get it published because you would need to bring $20,000 with you to get it published in open access. So it's strange. You say, okay, you want to have open access, but you have actually not the resources to do so. So it's actually anti-open science to do open access in this way. So you see that there are elements there's a game going on where people accommodate terminology you have introduced, but they implement it in a way that it has nothing to do with open science at all. In fact, it's the contrary. And the same is happening by the big publishers who actually has turned themselves in big data management industries, and they have the power to direct research and catch their researchers in their system. This is a new challenge for us, whether in science as such remains also a knowledge common good element. And I'm not sure if there is enough awareness in the public policy sector that this is actually at risk. Even with open science, which is now adopted by some of the other actors, could lead actually to a situation that this common knowledge as a common good is actually further at danger, or even stronger than before. So I think this is... I'm worrying about this, and this would also then connect to the type of prediction you can make. I mean, if the commodification and privatization of knowledge and the private exploitation of that science continues to stay only a competitive business, also in industrial terms. I don't say that you should not have competition, but if the overall picture is too much like that, if we don't counterbalance this with a collaborative public support of science, then we also don't get RRI. So this is and this is where my prediction based upon. If we can articulate this, then we have big chances to make progress. If we are not, then we still face the same issue as before. And so you can also look at the Green Deal as like that. If you look to it in ways, okay, this is a way of getting governments interested in outcomes and putting institutional constraints to market actors and incentives to produce particular outcomes. This can work. If this is done in terms of knowledge as a common good, then probably we'll get there. But if this is done in a way, let's say, in the same way as before, we say, okay, we just incentivize market actors and we leave it up to the market to produce these outcomes, then you will certainly get some outcomes, but not the type which we want. So not the type of outcomes which will actually solve also the issues. This is the double challenge. I would not dare to predict where we go. Maybe we will have to face a new crisis. If it takes too long to get the energy transition, if we are too slow in the process, maybe then public actors will get stronger in their interventions. That can also be. But it really depends on that element, I think.
Thank you for joining us today, Rene.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Christoph. Keep up the good work.
Thank you. The ResBIOS project is funded by the EU with the grant number 872146. To learn more about the ResBIOS project and the other pillars of RRI, please go to resbios.eu. Thank you for joining us. See you next time.